There is a curious pillar at Vidisha, almost at the center of India, which throws an interesting light on how history is perceived at different times by different people. It illustrates the process of how later generations take over the heritage left by their predecessors into their own lives. The incorporation, as it were, of the past by the present.
There are many instances in Indian history of incorporation of elements of the little tradition into the great tradition and vice versa. This pillar represents one such incorporation. This was erected here, just outside Vidisha, in Besnagar, by Heliodorus, who was the Greek ambassador from Takshila to Vidisha. Heliodorus writes on this pillar that he was a worshipper of Vasudeva, an incarnation of Vishnu. Vishnu had already been mentioned in the Vedas as one of the gods, but certainly he was not as important as Indra or Varun. Heliodorus writes that he worshipped Vishnu, and he worshipped Vasudeva as an incarnation of Vishnu. Now this is a very interesting thing, because this is the first historical mention we have of Vasudeva, who is also referred to as Krishna. Subsequently, after Heliodorus, this pillar was worshipped as Khamba Baba by the local Dhimor or fisherman community. The whole memory of Krishna, Vasudeva in this region disappeared, and a local deity, Khamba Baba, was created. Years afterwards, centuries in fact afterwards, when the Archaeological Survey of India took up this as one of the symbols of the Indian state, the Dhimar community was dispossessed of it, and it became a historical monument.
In fact, both history and culture have many meanings, and their complexities deserve to be explored in detail. History cannot be a mere chronological account of events and personalities. Indeed, history lives on in the present, in the lives of ordinary people. In this series, we try to understand how India is continuously being invented by its people, and its past is reconstructed through its present. We set out both as historians and documentary filmmakers to explore these complexities which constitute Indian history.
一番弱いんです。そこがね、あなたの健康面で腰が一番弱い。
ये शुरू से यहाँ राजा जयचंद्र रहते थे।
यहाँ बुद्ध के बारे में आप लोगों को मालूम है?
नहीं, अभी वो लोग बोल रहे थे, हम लोग भाग के आ गए यहाँ पे शूटिंग देखने के लिए।
Our exploration of the culture and civilization of India in historical outline has been inspired by D.D. Kosambi. D.D. Kosambi's findings have been contested several decades after his death. But the fact is that Kosambi has made signal contribution not only to the study of history, but to the evolution of its very methodology. Kosambi did not believe that history dealt with the dead past. He believed that history lives on in the present. And therefore, in studying history, Kosambi looked at how people live today. What are the tools they use, what are the rituals they practice, what is the food that they eat, what are the songs that they sing. And from that, he established a continuum between the past and the present. That was Kosambi's interpretation of history and his methodology. And it was that methodology which inspired us to carry out this exploration of the culture and civilization of India in historical outline.
Some people regard culture as purely a matter of intellectual and spiritual values, in the sense of religion, art, music, and so on. However, there are difficulties in taking this type of culture as the mainspring of history. Since religion is a major constituent of culture, it is noteworthy that a significant part of the Christian prayer asks the Lord to give us this day our daily bread. Man does not live by bread alone, but we have not yet developed a human breed that can live without bread, or at least some form of food. The basis of any formal culture must lie in the availability of food supply beyond that needed to support the actual food producer. A surplus provides the resources, but equally important, the time to engage in art, trade, and other activities. These in turn help in the production of further resources. Surplus production depends upon the technique and instruments used. Primitive food gatherers obviously produce very little surplus, and what they do produce is often divided and shared out by the women of the gathering group. This pattern still prevails among some people who are called tribals. With further development, the apportioning job is taken over by the patriarch, the tribal chief, the head of the clan. Women get subordinated as patriarchy develops. When the surplus is large and concentrated, a great temple may often decide upon its gathering and distribution through priestly guilds or the nobility. This has been the pattern in South India in particular. In exploring the contours of Indian history and culture, however, we cannot draw only mechanical, simple or deterministic conclusions. In India especially, culture often obscures economic realities. Take the case of the Bada Imam Bada at Lucknow. Its origin had much to do with food. It was built as a famine relief measure to provide employment to starving people, but it became a symbol of the feudal nobility of Awadh. In exploring India's past, we must take account of the hidden layers of the historical process which underlie every current social form. For instance, at the Buddhist cave monastery at Karle in Western India, we are reminded that popular religion has overtaken high philosophy. In fact, in terms of expression, language itself was formed out of the process of exchange, new goods, fresh ideas, and corresponding new words all going together. With the easy edifice complex which afflicts documentary filmmakers, we began our exploration with archaeology and sought history through monuments. Despite the monumental scale of past achievements, we soon discovered that conventional and scientific archaeology is unable to solve some really important questions, or even ask some of them.
While history is something which exists in everybody's life, some people find it mystifying. They find archaeology even more intimidating. Archaeology, after all, is a science which has its parameters and has its methods. But then you don't really have to be a specialized scientist in order to be an archaeologist. Kosambi said all that you need is a sturdy pair of legs and a walking stick with a ferrule. You don't have to dig deep. Sometimes things appear on the surface itself. And it is easy to make out different levels of living by just looking at houses or artifacts which exist on the surface. For instance, I am sitting on a rump of a house. It was made of mud. It has, over the period of time, gone. And now, on its place, stands another house. This exists in 3 levels. The lowest level has stone, then we have brick, and then finally we have mud. This is perhaps the work of one generation, but then it shows different levels of living which people in this area have had.
India, however, has one tremendous advantage that was not utilized till recently by historians. It includes within it the survival of many social forms that allow the reconstruction of totally diverse earlier stages. To find these strata, one has to move from cloistered libraries to the field where ordinary people live and work.
The special feature of Indian history is that time does not have a linearity. It is not as if people change their methods of living as they go along. At any given point of time, you can have people living as their forefathers would have done 2000 years before Christ, and of course existing 2000 years after Christ. Take the case of the Gaddis of the Kangra and Chamba valleys of Himachal Pradesh. Some of them live as pastoralists, taking their cattle across the passes, up over the hills. Others live as agriculturists and in the modern service and government sectors. The important thing is that these two groups are not discrete. They live on a social and temporal continuum, and they are part of the same scheduled tribe which receives positive discrimination under the Constitution.
Of course, in order to see the past from the vantage point of the present, we have to discount the influence of transport and communications, education, recent political developments, the cinema, radio, television, and trade, which is dominated by production in the cities. The fact is that India still remains a country of peasants. Agrarian development is extensive, though still largely with primitive technique. It is precisely this backward, inefficient, and local nature of production that has allowed so many older tribal groups to survive, even if they are on the verge of extinction. The influence of ecology on history and culture is obvious from the fact that the whole rural economy is still dominated by the seasonal rain, the monsoon. This causes between 20 to 200 inches of yearly rainfall in various parts of India. Anything less means a famine area or requires irrigation. In the flat coastal areas, which are now getting denuded of forest, 3 crops a year are possible. But the dense population is unable to subsist merely by consuming the local production. The economy, therefore, cashes in on crops like the coconut. The economic as well as the ritual importance of coconut demonstrates how easily new crops have been absorbed by the so-called unchanging Indian peasant. Mineral resources are only now being developed in the forests of central India and some wild areas of the peninsula to something like their full potential. Differences in geography and in natural resources led to different regions developing in different ways, some taking the high road and some taking the low dirt track. The main feature of Indian society, seen at its strongest in the rural part, is caste. This means the division of society into many groups which live side by side but often do not seem to live together. Members of different castes cannot intermarry by religion, though the law now permits complete freedom in this respect. The relative status of the castes, like the Julahas, a weaver caste for instance, always depends on the caste's economic position in the market. The same caste may have different positions in the hierarchy in different regions. At the lowest end of the economic scale, we still have purely tribal groups, many of whom are in a food-gathering stage. This stratification of Indian society reflects and explains a great deal of Indian history. The lowest castes often preserve tribal rites, usages, and myths.
Originally in India, the people can be described in English as tribes. They were related by kinship. They were related by internal bonds of solidarity, which were small, closed, village-oriented, even Mohalla-oriented, and they did not move out of marriage relationships. Such small locality-based kin groups tended to dominate for many, many centuries. And then over time, they clarified or ossified after clarification into castes.
A little higher up the social scale, we see these religious observances and legends in transition, often by assimilation into other parallel traditions. Another step above, these practices have been rewritten by Brahmins to suit themselves. This is what is called Hindu culture, the literate traditions that often go back to much older times, and other religious high traditions. Meanwhile, the multi-religious nature of India also needs to be noticed. Barely years after the crucifixion of Jesus, St. Thomas the Apostle, Doubting Thomas, brought the gospel to India. And while the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, was still alive, Islam came to Kerala. And then there were also the philosophical developments like Buddhism and Jainism, which were formulated by the great religious leaders of Indian history. This philosophizing was a considerable advance for Indian society when the doctrines were first propounded. The same doctrines, ironically, later contributed heavily to Indian society being kept back by dogma. Thinkers like Kabir fought this orthodoxy virtually from within the enemy camp in Varanasi.
Kabir, living in this city, grappling with all kinds of religious orthodoxy, had to use religious terminology in order to put his point of view across. He talked about both the ritualisms of the Hindu as well as the orthodoxy of the Muslims. About the Hindus, he said, "Patthar pooje hari mile, to main pooju pahar, tate ye chakki bhali, peace khaye sansar." If God can be achieved by worshipping stone, then it is much better to worship the grinding mill. The grinding mill is something which provides food for the whole world. About the Muslims, similarly, he said, "Kankar patthar chun ke masjid liya banaye, ta chadhi mulla bang de, kya bahra hua khudaye." You have picked up pebbles and stones and built a large mosque, and the mullah climbs up on that and crows like a rooster. Has God become deaf?
Religions themselves do not constitute history, but their rise and change of function is excellent for our exploration. Indian society seemed to develop more by successive religious transformation than by violence. However, while at times religions liberated mundane life, at others they also bogged it down through ritualism. The apparent lack of historical sense in India is rather simple and is bound up with rural production and the idiocy of village life. The bullock cart of the Harappans would cause no comment if it appeared suddenly in some modern Indian village. Despite changes in the modes of production, the modern Indian village still often gives an impression of poverty and helplessness. few public buildings, apart perhaps from a small temple which may be an outdoor shrine open to the elements. The uniform appearance of rural poverty hides a considerable differentiation. The bulk of the producers are peasants with small holdings. A few are self-sufficient. Some, however, may rise to be powerful in the sense of a rich peasant or kulak class. The systems of rural India changed most dramatically with the coming of cash crops. Otherwise, they had remained virtually unchanged during India's long medieval period, including the Sultanate and the Mughal Empire. However, with the cash crops, the British also brought about changes in the system of administration of economic resources. Some methods were quite bizarre.
In those days, when the British people came, tribal people can be won over by giving some presents, tobacco, cigarettes and such things. But to clear off the bamboo groups, they found that it is better to get some 10 rupees coin or 20 rupees coin thrown into the midst of the bamboo. Then these people will get it cut cleared and take back that money. And thereby the labor is considerably reduced and economically they have cleared the land. That was a very ingenious way of doing it.
In fact, no village can today be self-contained. Even the most secluded must sell something, not only to buy the little cloth and household goods required, but to pay some taxes or rent. In this respect, India has been more than twice blessed by nature. Greek chroniclers at the time of Alexander described it as a wondrous land where wool grew on trees. They were referring to cotton. In most of India, clothing is not a physical necessity, though it has become a social need. Salt, however, has always been indispensable, and metals in some quantity had to be available before regular agriculture could be practiced. These two necessities are not produced in most villages, but have to be acquired from the outside. In spite of its timeless appearance, the village too is tied to commodity production. Some production requires specialized technical knowledge. The villager does need pots, usually of earthenware. This means that a potter must be available. For centuries, the potter's craft has remained unchanged, and only recently has the market inspired innovations. The same applies to other craftsmen. Today, transport is easier, so that tin and metal pots have reduced the number of potters who work mostly to sell their products against cash. However, the potter still carries out certain ritual tasks which may date from prehistoric urn burial. With time, some of these tasks have virtually made him the priest to certain lower castes. The differentiation within the village is by caste, even beyond that between artisan and peasant or priest. Some people are barely out of the food-gathering stage. As a rule, they have also the right of gleaning after the harvest, whether they have helped in the work or not. Their primitive tribal gods have something in common with the lower village gods. Often, they worship the gods of a village, and the village recognizes their deities too. The peasant, however, also worships other higher gods which look primitive enough but go a step above the local gods. There may be a guardian of the fields or of the village, suitably modernized. The elders are commemorated by a slab. Still higher come the Brahmin gods, Shiva, Vishnu, the incarnations of Vishnu, such as Ram and Krishna. Meanwhile, in terms of secular life too, Indian history evolved through fits and starts, with succeeding generations building on the legacies of their predecessors.
History has a habit of growing on itself. Modern buildings come up on sites which are old. The establishment of a Buddhist stupa on the ruins of Mohenjo-daro is just one instance. Many cities have come up on megalithic burial sites. And this Nalagarh Koti, on top of the Harappan ruins at Rupnagar, otherwise called Ropad, is yet another instance of such an appropriation of history by later generations.
In daily life, this is best illustrated through religion. Even as the culture of India evolved, the older gods were not smashed, but adopted or adjusted. Religion thus gave some unity to what would have been social fragments without a common bond. The process was of crucial importance in the history of India. First, in developing the country from tribe to society, and then holding it back, bogged down in the filthy swamp of superstition. The continuation of the primitive into the modern is illustrated by the spring festival Holi, which is celebrated with zest. This is in spite of the fact that it has become a rather depraved Saturnalia. In prehistory, when diet was poor, life hard, and procreation was generally difficult, such license might well have been a necessary stimulus. Nevertheless, Holi continues to reflect the traditional in the modern and the ritualistic in the secular in Indian society. At the same time, modern secular rituals have also developed, and they symbolize the urge for rationality and republicanism, urges that the people follow in inventing India. These varieties of institutions, practices and urges are what we are exploring in the culture and civilization of India in Historical Outline.